My name is Ross McKittrick. I'm a full professor of economics at the University of Guelph, where I specialize in environmental economics. I've published on both the economics of climate change and statistical analysis in climatology. I was an expert reviewer for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Fourth Assessment Report, and in 2006, I was one of 12 experts from around the world asked to brief a panel of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences examining paleoclimate reconstruction methodology. The global warming issue is often described with emphatic claims that the science is settled, the situation is urgent, and the necessary actions are obvious. The reality is that there are deep disagreements about underlying scientific issues. There is reason to believe the problem has been exaggerated, and most policy proposals simply do not pass objective cost-benefit tests. Second, the official process for assessing technical and scientific information on climate change for the purpose of advising policymakers has become untrustworthy due to bias and partisanship. As a member of the expert review team for the last IPCC report, I saw things take place that violated long-standing principles of peer review. I documented some of them in various publications since 2007, but the issues never received much attention until the fall of 2009, when thousands of emails from top IPCC scientists were leaked onto the internet. The so-called ClimateGate emails confirmed the reality of bias and cronyism in the IPCC process. The new leaks last month, you may not know, but another 5,000 emails were leaked back in November, provided even more confirmation that climate scientists privately express greater doubts and disagreement about climate science among themselves than is reflected in IPCC reports. The IPCC is not a neutral observer of the scientific process. Instead, it has a party line. It is controlled by a relatively small bureau in Geneva, consisting of a small core surrounded by a network of supportive academics and government officials. The oversight body, called the IPCC Plenary Panel, is passive, inattentive, and overly deferential to the Bureau. In effect, there is no oversight. The Bureau picks lead authors who share their views. They are routinely placed in the position of reviewing their own work and that of their critics, and are free to rule in their own favor. Lead authors are also free to reject reviewer comments, override review editors, and even rewrite text after the close of the peer review process. The combination of Bureau control over the selection of lead authors and a toothless peer review process means that IPCC assessments are guaranteed merely to repeat and reinforce a set of foregone conclusions that make up the party line. In my report, I document some disturbing cases where the IPCC violated proper peer review practices. These include manipulating prominent graphs so as to conceal known flaws in the statistical basis of paleoclimate reconstructions and to exaggerate evidence that modern climate change is historically exceptional.
My name is Ian Clark. I'm a professor, as I say, at the University of Ottawa of Earth Sciences. And so we haven't really seen any global warming for about the past 10 years, some say since the 1998 El Nino. And this is in stark contrast with the IPCC forecast of an increase of some 0.2 degrees per decade that should have occurred during this period. So this is quite controversial, what's going on at that time. Is this 20th century warming unusual? Well, we go back to 1,000 years before present, and we see a warm period, which we call the medieval warm period, which occurred centered on 1,000 years ago, lasted about 200 years, well documented by agricultural records. The Vikings settled in Greenland and came to Canada. So there's lots of documentation and proxy records for the medieval warm period, followed by the Little Ice Age and then 20th century warming. But during that period, we didn't see any effect of CO2. So CO2 was flat during this time, and so there's no correlation with this greenhouse gas. We go back further in time, here over the last 10,000 years, and this is the Holocene interglacial following the past glacial period when glaciers covered Canada. And we see that here, the 20th century warming is one of a series of climate optima. There's the medieval warming period, the Roman climate optimum during the time of Christ, and then we go back further in the Holocene and we see various optima, warm periods of varying intensity and duration. So the current 20th century climate warming is really one of a series, is nothing unusual. Furthermore, throughout this period, CO2 was a relatively steady 280 ppm. So CO2 had nothing to do with these warming periods.
Again, we're not all scientists here, only one of us, and not me. You keep talking about greenhouse gases on the one hand, and then you say CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and then H2O factor. Just what? There's a colloquialism out there in the world that's become part of our regular vocabulary, greenhouse gases, but I don't think anybody really knows what they're saying when they say it.
Can I
so if you could
that?
give a definition, it'd be great.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. The planet, and these are the slides that I cut from my talk, the planet without what we call greenhouse gases, with just a transparent atmosphere of nitrogen and oxygen, would be about 32 degrees colder than today. We'd have a planet which would be unlivable, it would be frozen. Thanks to one greenhouse gas, which is water vapor, and what water vapor does in the atmosphere is it absorbs the outgoing radiation. When we warm the planet with solar radiation during the day, it emits that radiation throughout the day and throughout the night. So the planet cools. If we trap that outgoing radiation, what we call long-wave radiation or infrared radiation, like what you see on the hot plates in fast food restaurants, the heat is retained in the atmosphere and warms the Earth's surface. So we retain a planet which is now 14 degrees above zero and habitable. CO2 represents a couple percent of that greenhouse gas effect. It's a very minor greenhouse gas. Water does all the work.
Many people think that the science of climate change is settled. It isn't. And the issue is not whether there has been an overall warming during the past century. There has. Also, it was not uniform, and none was observed during the past decade. The geologic record provides us with abundant evidence for such perpetual natural climate variability, from ice caps reaching the equator to none at all, even at the poles. The climate debate is in reality not about carbon dioxide, but about 1.6 watts per square meter discrepancy, or this kind of uncertainty in a poorly known planetary energy balance. This is an absolute fundamental statement to start with. Without our atmosphere, the planet would be a frozen ice ball. Natural greenhouse warming is warming it up by 33 degrees C. Next, 2/3 of this warming, or more, up to, well, perhaps even 95% of this warming is really due to water vapor, not to CO2. Okay? So water vapor, not carbon dioxide, is by far the most important greenhouse gas. Yet what the models do, they treat the water cycle as just being there, relegating to a passive agent in the climate system. The energy that is then required to drive water cycle must therefore come from somewhere else. The sun, which drives the water cycle then generates climate, and climate decides how much jungle, how much tundra and so on we will have, and therefore drives around the carbon cycle. Okay? Not an actual empirical or experimental proof that carbon dioxide is a driver. Okay? So our atmosphere contains about 730 billion tons of carbon. Each year, about 120 billion tons are cycled via plants on land, and about 90 through the oceans. It's absolutely dominant. The human emission account for less than the 5% of annual carbon cycle. Okay?
Less than how much?
5%.